menial labor, obsessive cleanliness. When if you do not clean something correctly, it becomes a subject of, oh, there's something wrong with you spiritually, or it's a sign of something.
Right, that's a big theme in
you.
Scientology.
Yeah, it also in the New York Magazine story about the Sarah Lawrence cult. It's another thing that happens there.
So at this point,
there's cleaning.
Just to clarify, at this point we're talking about a group of people IRL that are moving together, and there's some people that are still participating remotely online.
Yes, exactly. There's kind of a revolving cast of individuals who move in with the group and follow them from city to city. Some leave, others arrive. And I'm kind of just describing, like, at least at the beginning, a typical day would be cleaning, then these sort of very, very long psychoanalysis sessions, or it's not real psychoanalysis, but psychoanalytic-like discussions, interrogating, the ways that you've been conditioned by society or the pain matrix, or things that happened in your youth that conditioned you in a certain way, with the goal of you're ridding yourself of this programming from a problematic society. And then also posting on Facebook, fundraising on social media, trying to recruit more people to the organization. Eventually, it's kind of unclear how much money was coming in to our main source, where all the money was coming from. But they kind of are moving from place to place, doing this, being sent on different missions. And eventually there reaches a point where they're in Phoenix, and there appears to be an issue with money, and the soldiers, as the recruits are called, they have different positions using like the ranks of an army, but we call them the soldiers to represent the members who are not the main leaders. They start spending more and more time on the street. They have an arrangement, or they're given a mission, which is that they need to secure a certain amount of money every day to give to the group's leaders in order for the group's leaders to have a hotel or motel accommodation for the night and food. And then on top of that, any money that is made, well, they're not allowed to directly handle the money, and they're not allowed to spend money without the group's consent. But if they made more money than that, with the leader's consent, they may be able to use the money for their own lodging and food. And so they essentially are housing insecure.
Right. Homeless.
Homeless. Was how Matthew described it at the time. And the very kind of painful paradox of the situation was that the soldiers were not actually allowed to hold conventional jobs in practice in order to make these monetary contributions. So they could only do things that corresponded to this idea of, or I guess corresponded to the group's acceptable methods of raising money, and sort of this idea of social currency. So hitting people up on social media, hitting up friends and family for money, and then and then eventually, in order to make money, Matthew, our main character, began going on dates for money. And Yeah. So
why?
that's
And
kind of
I mean, so many of these stories end in sexual exploitation, which is, a where things are abject. That's where they tend to lead. But how is that even justified within the logic? Within the fucked up interior logic of the cult itself.
because it's this idea of it's an acceptable way of money. Sorry, it's an acceptable way of making money because it involves making money off of your presence alone,
right?
As opposed
so
to
does data management.
Making an object.
Right, like,
I guess that,
I understand that we all understand that this is insane, or I don't know. I don't want to say insane, but that this logic is very skewed. But I'm still, like, even within the logic of these people, that is such a highlightable form of exploitation that, like, that's the metaphor people use when they're talking about exploitation, That's like they talk about, I feel like I'm being prostituted at this job, right? Like, that's a colloquialism. Mm-hmm. So the idea that that's a way to avoid exploitation is so bananas.
What's also bananas is that work is, quote unquote conventional work is off limits to these people. But, that kind of work is not considered conventional work, where, which is like part of the conversation of like, is sex work work? Yes, it is work.
Right.
But yeah, it's just all very confusing.
Right.
Yeah, even though it's contradictory, but it is all sort of moving in this same direction, and also of kind of making the people in the organization feel that they have never given enough. They always owe more money. They always, haven't escaped their conditioning enough to deserve better treatment.
Right. No, it brings to mind the two key factors of debt in most people's lives, which is student debt and housing debt. Right, like mortgages and student debt are the major bubbles that are driving sort of lecherous financial institutions that we don't even consider lecherous. They're just too big to fail, to use a 2008 term. And we have been conditioned to think that is necessary steps to maintain sort of a secure position in society. So the mirroring there is really fascinating. And the other mirror that's fascinating to me as well is this sort of self-help feedback loop that also springs up around this time in the form of like the sort of goop industrial complex of like the sweet greens and the bar classes and goop and all these serums and things like that, which are ultimately meant to make you more productive, happier, more engaged with your work, a better part of society, and all of that is to basically have enough capital to keep affording these products. I mean, I'm cribbing some of this from a Gio Tolentino essay about bar classes, but also just some of my observations around just the hucksterism around self-help and how it's selling you things to get you out of buying things. What comes to mind really essentially is oh God, now I'm blanking on it. What's that minimalist guru who tells you to throw out everything? Marie Kondo starting her own line of products, right? Like
Marie
the
Kondo?
irony there is too delightful that it's again bananas.
I think what's also interesting is that this group would critique those sorts of lifestyle, or not movements, but those sorts of chintzy, like, you know, goop culture, like self-help culture, and make fun of New Age. I think they even had a Facebook group that was like making fun of New Age culture. But then they do operate in a similar way, where the premise is also to have the individuals who are in the group act as kind of lifestyle influencers, where they post about how their lives have been transformed by these philosophies, and pictures of their transformation. They call it like a glow up, wearing all white. But then what we kind of sussed out was that it's not just that. It's not just kind of creating this aspirational image. It's actually an instrument of control of the members, where it is it's often making people write these sorts of confessional posts or do confessional like live videos of themselves, where they're essentially, in many ways, kind of self-flagellating, where they talk about their story and how much their lives have improved, but also how far they have to go, and the way that they're publicly doing almost a mea culpa about how this aspect of their conditioning they haven't escaped yet. And Matthew told us, about how the posting is not just, it's not just promotion. It's also a way to, it could be a punishment. Like, you did something wrong, now you need to do all these posts. Or
it's so funny to hear just like that language attached to the mechanisms of cults, which is obviously about this like pain and punishment and reward systems, but then the ultimate thing being posting is it's so contemporary. It's funny in this like really twisted way.
But you see how dark. But yeah, you see how these kind of ordinary, everyday technologies that we interact with can be used in such an abusive way.
Right, but it also makes you reflect on how we're all doing that. We all are in this cult in a way, right? Like, this is a magnified version of how these platforms are already working. Like, how many mea culpas and how much self-flagellation and how much call-out, like, is happening on these platforms. Some over things that are justified, some that are not, but the language around it and the way that we're expected to behave publicly around certain issues casts a very similar shadow. And we're in very tricky water right now, so I'm being very careful because I'm careful to not sort of deplatform people that are able to speak out in ways that they should be, and I'm also not criticizing people who are publicly saying, letting people in on lessons they've learned about how certain social issues should be handled. However, I think there still remains a dark side to this that is encouraged by the technology itself, that is outside of the politics of any specific issue that it's dealing with.
And the crazy thing is that sorry to interrupt, but the cult actively kind of uses that argument, where they say, you're already being brainwashed, so why not be brainwashed with us? But you're already in one or more cults that are run by these awful people. They harp on conspiracy theories, and that's the thing is but it's bad faith, because there's a diagnosis of society that many people have addressed. There's a diagnosis that many people can, on some level or maybe on surface value, identify with, but then the answer is not you know, typically